Hello and good morning. It is time for another weekly wisdom. It is Tuesday at 9 a.m. Eastern, and I'm here to give you another glimpse into the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and maybe a couple tips that you can take with you as you're trying to bolster those in your workplace. So today's topic I'm excited to discuss is all about promoting gender equity in your workplace. And we're just going to talk about 3 ways that you can do this within your workplace so that you feel better equipped to bring about more gender equity. Before we dig into those tips, I do want to start by sharing with you what exactly gender equity is. Sometimes when we have this conversation, we do have people get gender equality and gender equity confused. So let me quickly explain the difference. So if you're familiar with the difference between equality and equity, it can go a long way to understanding the difference here. If you can imagine, gender equality is treating everyone the same no matter what their gender is. Gender equity is acknowledging that because of various systemic historical experiences of people who are not men, there is a need to balance the ways that we've been experiencing work or that they have been experiencing work. So people who are not men have been historically disenfranchised by different systems, by different biases, by different marginalizations. And because of that, gender equity is about maybe treating people differently, but it promotes fairness. So it means maybe treating women differently than men, maybe treating people who are non-binary differently than men, but with the idea that that treatment is going to promote fairness and going to realign some of the systemic imbalances that have happened in the past. So for example, you might want to create an event or an exhibition or a program that is meant to promote women and meant to create networks for women. That's something that is an example of a gender equity intervention because it's happening just for women. The men don't have that, but historically men have had that, right? And men have had a lot of those kinds of in unofficial social bonds because of how historically men have been dominant within workplaces and within corporate cultures. So what we often say is that gender equity and the acts that are associated with it can lead to gender equality. But I do always want to be very, very, very careful about saying this because I don't want people to think if I do one gender equity driven intervention, suddenly we are a gender equal place, especially when you consider all of the genders that are out there and how historically people have been disenfranchised, not just women, but those who are non-binary or trans. There is a lot of correcting to do. There's a ton of gender equity intervention that we need to do, especially when we think about all of that. And we know that there's so much room, even just for women, to be able to find themselves within these corporate spaces and accelerate at the same rate as men. So I am going to be talking specifically about gender equity. This is a session where we're just going to talk about those 3 ways you can promote gender equity in your workplace. And that means maybe doing some things differently for different groups of people and recognizing that that's a way for us to eventually get to a place where everyone has that equal experience. So let's talk about it. What's our first way? I feel like we bring up bias all the time in these weekly wisdoms, but talking about bias can be very important here. I think sometimes when we talk about biases that are related to gender or related specifically to maternal experiences for people have their general stereotypes and experiences and recognitions around what this might look like. But particularly for male employees, men who have not had the experience of really feeling this pressure their whole lives, like many groups that experience privilege, they might need additional support in understanding this and then getting buy-in around why this is so important and around why their actions may be perpetuating some inequity within your organization. So having these conversations about gender bias, about maternity bias is important with all of your employees, but especially with the men within your organization, who again, because of certain privileges based on that identity, might not have a clear understanding of how pervasive and incredibly overwhelming those biases can be. Specifically, maternal bias has so many pieces of research. I call it the maternal wall of bias because there's just so much that happens to specifically women who end up either bearing children and are visibly pregnant or who are experiencing just having kids at home. And if people know it, they're likely to treat them differently based on this particular bias and not get the same opportunities. So having discussions about this can be really, really powerful. Let's go ahead and talk about the next one. The next one is around encouraging men to take parental leave and decrease the stigma. So what we know about this is that this is one of the major reasons why we have not seen as many women progress to top tier senior levels as we've seen men over the past millennia. That's an exaggeration. But if you can think about the idea that when someone becomes a parent, if they're not taking the same amount of leave when they become a parent, say in this case, thinking about men and women in particular, if men are taking less leave when they become a parent than a woman is within your organization, that's already impacting their trajectory to becoming more senior within their organization. And that's something that we see all the time. And so organizations are still working toward offering parental leave that is the same as, there's sometimes these ideas around having a paternity leave and a maternity leave, and they being very different from each other in terms of length. First step would be to consider creating a parental leave policy that is blanket across both. And then the second step would be to not just encourage men to take parental leave, but then to decrease the stigma, because we find that even in the spaces where that equality exists, there's still a stigma around taking that time off because there are biases that are existent in these systemic and structural ideas and expectations around what men do. Remember, you probably fill in the blanks around some of the things that people have said, those stereotypes around how men bring home the bacon and the women stay home with the kids. Some of that is still deeply ingrained with a lot of these conversations. And so it's important to decrease that stigma and encourage men to take that parental leave. Here's the next one, and the last one we'll talk about here today, which is increase flexibility for all employees and track that flexibility to encourage fairness. Oh, that's supposed to say fairness. Apologies for the typo. So we want to make sure that we're increasing flexibility for all employees and tracking to encourage fairness. That's going to bother me. I'm going to go ahead and put and change it up here so that we have that in there. And it's important that we think about this, because what we know is that there are certain organizations or certain demographics in our companies that really value having the flexibility that we have all had over the course of the last 2.5 years during the pandemic. There are many different demographic groups within workplaces that have truly appreciated and shown a desire to lean into the flexibility that workplaces have allowed for over the course of the pandemic. Those groups include women and people of color. And so what we see is that as companies are going back to work, and as companies are spending their time, adjusting to this hybrid space, adjusting to going back to the office, we might see certain demographic groups taking more advantage of staying home, in which case it's important for you to increase flexibility for all of your employees and then to track and encourage fairness across this benefit. So that means ensuring that people are taking advantage of this at roughly the same amount. So it means maybe encouraging some people that you're seeing not take advantage of that flexibility to take advantage of that flexibility. It means ensuring that everyone has access to these opportunities, not just those who maybe fit a certain profile. So these are the 3 suggested ways of improving gender equity or promoting gender equity within your workplace. Again, I'm going to quickly go through them for you, and then I want to quickly give you a short tidbit. So discussing gender bias and maternal bias with employees, especially men, encouraging men to take parental leave, decreasing the stigma, and then increasing flexibility for all employees and tracking that to encourage fairness. All of these involve treating a particular group maybe a little bit differently. So this is making sure that your men are getting that kind of training. Everyone's getting that training, right? But just making sure that this is really sinking in for people who are not typically experiencing it. And then, of course, encouraging them to take that parental leave, decreasing the stigma is super important. And then increasing that flexibility for all employees, it involves also tracking it so that you can make interventions accordingly. I do want to say that for all of this, it's important for us to remember that there are so many ways to promote gender equity within our workplace. This month being Women's History Month, and this we just had International Women's Day a couple of days ago. It is vastly important that we think about how we can involve and promote women at the same rate, eventually, as men and anyone else. I also do want to emphasize that when we talk about gender equity, we are primarily often talking about women, but we also should expand the conversation beyond, right, to those who identify as genders other than male. And there are many different things that you can do to do that. I did want to quickly share with you that we have a very I think, important blog about how not just we talk about that non-binary group or whatnot, but we also can talk about women of color and the intersection that we see, because sometimes when we talk about women, we might be thinking about one kind of woman, but of course there are many different women out there. So this is a helpful blog that you might want to check out on seenatwork.com. Okay, I usually try to keep these within 10 minutes. This one is almost 12 minutes long, so I should close it out. It is lovely, as always, to speak with you today or to be able to share something like this with you. Remember, you can reach us at seenatwork.com. You can schedule a consultation at any time. We're happy to chat with you about some of these initiatives or about increasing that gender equity within your organization. And with that, I will see you next week. Thanks, everyone.